Hello and welcome to session 2 of MarSec20+, which is a panel discussion centering around whether the maritime security industry is fit for the purpose of protecting vessels, offshore infrastructure, ports, seafarers and companies effectively in the evolving landscape of threats and vulnerabilities. As we know, the oceans cover about 70% of the Earth's surface. More than 90,000 merchant ships, small and large, trade to over 830 ports, carrying 80% of the world trade by volume and 70% by value. The major shipping lanes have been described as the arteries of the world, and we rely on the reach and just-in-time efficiency of the global supply chain for most of what we consume. How then do you go about securing something as enormous and important as the maritime domain from manifold threats such as piracy, corruption, cargo theft, stowaways, contraband smuggling and terrorism, to name but some? How much security can we reasonably expect to achieve in our ports, on our ships and across our seas? Are industry expectations high enough? Is there enough ambition and engagement in the sectors that maritime security companies exist to serve? Is anyone willing to pay for security? Does regulation help or hinder? Is best management practice guidance really enough, or is it a convenient cop-out when things go wrong because it is only guidance? Are we anywhere close in getting maritime security right? If not, where are we going wrong and why? And what do we need to do to put it right in both the short and long term? To discuss these and other questions, I'm joined today by 4 seasoned industry professionals. John Thompson is co-founder and the account management director of Ambry, one of the world's largest maritime security companies. Neil Dulling is the HSSEQ manager in the LNG division of MOL, where, in amongst his many duties, he is also the company security officer. Gary Breggin is a security consultant at ManGuard Plus, providers of security services to the Port of Dublin. And Simon Church, who is EU NAVFOR's Special Advisor for Industry Relations and the ex-director of the Maritime Security Centre, Horn of Africa. Welcome, gentlemen. John, over the last decade, Ambry has grown quickly to become the largest provider of privately contracted armed guards to the shipping industry. You also provide a range of security services, operate a 30-strong fleet of vessel-based armories, escort vessels and support craft, and you have a shipyard in Southampton and a marine insurance brokerage in London. In that context, it might seem an odd question to ask, but is there such a thing as the maritime security industry? And if so, do you think it's fit for purpose?
Thanks, James. It's been roughly 10 years, I would say, since the scourge of Somali piracy kicked off, and many of the people on this call will be familiar with what the early years of that were like. Fast forward 10 years, and you've got a similar frequency of attacks from pirates off Nigeria, and obviously a much quieter situation off Somalia. But across the world, you've got clients facing a myriad of threats and challenges beyond just piracy in the maritime security and organised crime space. I think to answer the first question, a resounding yes. You know, the security industry is certainly embedded in the psyche of the shipping industry in a way it just wasn't 10 or 15 years ago. And I think the industry itself has come up with solutions. And to answer your second question, is it fit for purpose? Well, one of the reasons it's embedded in the psyche is because it's been effective. So, you know, you can still hear it many times over in the industry that any ship that's taken embarked armed guards has not been pirated successfully. And that's still true to this day, despite some of the challenges the industry faces. But just beyond embarked armed guards to other services within the industry, be that security escort vessels, intelligence provision, kidnap and ransom and crisis services, they all exist for a reason, because their clients want them to exist, because they're effective, and they broadly achieve the aim. You know, those that are dutifully applying best management practice, and I think we're going to go on to what that actually is later on. will actually ultimately have a lack of incidents on their vessels, either the successful repelling of pirates or of organised criminals trying to get on board to steal items or to take cash from the crew, or it ultimately deterring them from actually even getting on board in the first place. So I think to answer your question, yes, but there are a myriad of challenges that go with it.
Thanks, John. Neil, you're the CSO for the world's largest fleet of LNG carriers. And it could be argued that shipping and ship owners and charterers in particular have been slow to embrace security, implementing procedures and process-based systems only because they were forced to by regulation, and being slow to identify and respond to threats such as Somalia-based piracy and the piracy in the Gulf of Guinea of their own volition. Why do you think it is that shipping has found security such a difficult subject to get to grips with compared, say, to other global industries?
Good morning, James. I think it's a very challenging question to answer overall, but initially, most of the security for shipping is not really under our control. A lot of it is done by port security. A lot of it is done by the flag states on our behalf. When we are being attacked by pirates in the middle of the ocean, we are not allowed by regulation to do anything other than run away. We are required by flag states to get their authority as a subsequent solution after it's happened to be able to use private maritime security, because there are not enough naval forces in the world, which is the method that was designed to protect the shipping and ship owners. So to say that ship owners didn't react and didn't do enough is more than unfair. We were supposed to be being protected by our flag states while we were out in the middle of the ocean. And we are meant to be protected and supported by the ports and port authorities when we're in the port. We have no control as a ship manager over what goes on in that port. All we can control is who comes up our gangway and what comes on board our ships. And in many cases, we don't even have the authority or position from contractual bases to be able to do that. So it's a very difficult thing for a ship owner to do. And was extremely difficult for us to react to in any kind of quick way, because we are on contracts. We have those negotiated contracts with the port authorities, with our charterers. It takes time and effort and permission to change those things. So from the owner's perspective and from a ship's perspective, the security and the situation that came to us was completely out of our control.
Thanks, Neil. Gary, you have over 20 years experience in the security sector, generally speaking, and you're studying, as I understand it, for a professional doctorate at the University of Portsmouth, focusing on the development of training syllabuses for the security industry internationally, and that's your subject matter expertise. So if I can ask you, how does the maritime security sector compare to security sectors in other industries for effectiveness, cohesiveness and maturity?
Morning, James. Well, if we can kind of compare and contrast the maritime security and, say, for example, retail security, right? If you look at the European retail theft barometer from 2019, 39% of losses come from external theft, 39% come from internal theft, 7% are from vendor fraud, and 15% are administration errors, right? So if you look at the resources that are put into the maritime security, the same levels are not put into countering internal theft. If you look around, 50 years ago, maritime security largely involved undersea ordnance clearing and cable laying, right? That changed in 1985 with the hijacking of the Aqua Loro, right? The maritime security sector is different from land-based security operations because the threats emerge and fade and emerge and fade. This is in different parts of the world. In the 1990s, piracy was not a huge issue. It was largely small-scale theft. Regulations such as the ISPS code post 9/11 generated a huge requirement for ship and port facility security assessments and plans. Many of these were conducted by inexperienced security personnel, kind of masquerading as security experts. The Somali piracy years of 2008 to 2012 were the worst years, and a number of security companies were formed to provide privately contracted armed security personnel on board ships for transits through these high-risk areas, the Gulf of Aden, the Indian Ocean. The maritime security sector varies enormously in terms of competence and capability. I mean, if you look at data center security, there's zero tolerance for security breaches, and there's a massive level of compliance through the likes of GDPR and stuff.
Thanks, Gary. And you raised some interesting points there, and some that I'll come back to, but I think one of the interesting issues is how we begin to define maritime security, the maritime security industry, therefore. But before we move on, let's hear from Simon. Simon, you've been working to build bridges in communication and understanding between the merchant marine and the Navy forces of Europe for the last 12 years. How far have we come in developing that? And how much do you think there is still to do?
Good morning, James, and thanks for having me on. I think when you look back to 2008, when I joined the UNAVFOR, there was little or no relationship between deployed military forces at sea and the wider shipping industry. And they really came from two different worlds, and that lack of any formal link made it very difficult to establish a relationship where one didn't exist. But I think in many ways we were really forced together because of the gravity of the crisis that gripped the world at that time. The number of attacks that I remember witnessing in 2008 and 2009, especially in the first year, it was at a rate of 2 to 3 per day. There was one hijack per week. We had 50 ships hijacked in the first year. So we were really overwhelmed. And I think the shipping industry was also completely overwhelmed. We didn't have any specific guidance. We needed to act quickly, and we needed to generate a exchange of information that would allow us to help protect vulnerable ships. And that was the beginning of the doctrine of best management practice. And I think it was also this evidence of assistance that, when 999 was called, when UKMTO were called, those information platforms and the exchange of emergency calls allowed military forces to intervene. And we conducted countless interventions, especially in the Gulf of Aden, where we had assets and helicopters available to do that. And I think that's where the trust was built. And it was on the basis of that the maritime security architecture we then went on to build was formed. Turning to your second question about what still needs to be done, I think that just by the nature of military operations and how they work, to those who work in them, is that the sheer frequency and rotation of staff through and around different operations never really leaves enough time for the expertise to be fully acquired. And that expertise is then lost as these people then move on into other jobs. We fully understand how the military works, but I think that if governments were really serious about maritime security, and they have the will to invest in the expertise to embed people and to cultivate that expertise, to continue that and support the industry in a way that they do when they're in the operation, but they can't when they leave. So I think that's what I think looking forward would make a real difference.
Thanks, guys. I mean, we raised quite a few issues there. We're dealing with a myriad of threats. We're developing a culture of security. Certainly the concepts embedded, as John used the term, in the mindset of the industry. And we're also facing certain market realities and constraints on ship owners, particularly, and maybe ports. Maybe Gary, you can talk to that in a bit. So let's just have a look, if we can, for a second, at really what we're looking at with market realities. And I just want to propose a thought that the maritime industry's approach to compliance, conformity, and cost might be limiting the development further of an effective security culture. In other words, what's the minimum we need to do to comply with regulations? What is everybody else doing? And how much is security going to cost? And are we willing to pay for it? And I would suggest as a question that these are potential major constraints. But John, what do you think are the key constraints on the development of a mature and effective security culture in the maritime industry?
Interestingly, I think over the last 10, 12 years, a broad framework of standards and practices has been developed. So in the Indian Ocean, you've got City and Guilds developed the MSO course, BIMCO developed GuardCon, ISO 28007 has come in, and obviously BMP we're on version 5. So there's a broad framework there. It's far more immature for the Gulf of Guinea, and we can come to that in a moment. But I think ultimately, much of this is guidance. It's regulatory, but with little teeth. And actually, you could question whether some of those standards are actually failing. The audit process that goes around them is failing. And a huge amount of what security involves is good judgment mixed with good communication. And whether you're on the sell side effectively as a company like us offering the services, or on the buy side, like someone like Neil might be as a CSO, too much is left to subjectivity. And the very nature of the shipping industry, it's kind of fragmented nature, both in terms of ownership, management, and charterers and flag states and the various stakeholders involved, just leaves too much to be left to subjectivity. And that's where things typically fall down, because in an environment where there are huge commercial pressures, which there always are, but particularly so at the moment, that subjectivity inevitably leads to poor decision making. And it's those poor decisions that then lead to ultimately crew being let down and put in a position that they should never have been in the first place.
Gary, have you seen something similar in the port sector or other industries? And if you have, how were they overcome?
Well, I mean, everything within our sector, you know, it all dovetails around, you know, the Phillips principle or return on investment. Okay, so I mean, if you look at the compliance biases that you had, you know, the cost biases, like we have 150 biases within us as humans. You've only named 3. So if we can break them down and explain them through, like the compliance bias is ultimately cost related, right? It's based on ethics, CSR. You have rational choice theory that comes in there. So the principle of compliance as a cost benefit calculation, like Becker and Posner have written exclusively on this topic. As a rule, people will buy less as the cost rises. So there's an inference that we are less likely to invest if compliant behavior. We're less likely to invest in compliant behavior as the cost rises. So compliance it's higher in areas where the sanctions are highest. So to give you an example, the US Coast Guard in 2018 refused 7 countries that weren't ISPS compliant. Okay, they're not even level 1. They had to be compliant at level 2. Those countries adopted ISPS because the cost of doing business with the states was greater than inputting the cost of the ISPS sanctions. It just makes sense. From a cost bias perspective, you know, let's be honest, the cost of increasing security is much lower than the cost of any potential cost of a major terrorist attack. Like the OECD wrote this paper in 2003, and it's still today. It's still the same. I mean, the cost of preventing 9/11 would have been far greater than the cost of 9/11. And just if we can use Ireland as a bias, Ireland as an example, right? We put VRT, right, vehicle registration tax on cars coming into the country, right? Under EU law, that's illegal, but the cost that we generate from the VRT is less than the fine from the EU, so we still continue to do it because it's a return on investment. It might not be ethically okay, it might not be, you know, CSR compliant, but that's what happens. And from your conformity bias, I mean, that's really just knee-jerk reactions to what happens within the industry. If Port A does something, Port B will do that, or near them will kind of, they will do the same. Look, most ports are compliant at level 1. Look, it really comes down to cost. Security is down to cost and budgets. And I mean, you know, I think I had figures here yesterday. In 2080, there was 102 million tons shipped. You know, in 2016, there was 1.7 billion tons shipped. That's a 17% or 17-fold increase. But the amount of security and the resources from security haven't increased to the same level. Like, we are intertwined, whether we like it or not, within the global supply chain and international trade. We are intertwined, and if that affects VAT, if that affects production in countries, the governments will step in.
Thanks, Neil. Gary. Neil, is security simply a cost issue for ship owners, or is it one, say, of awareness or relevance?
Cost is a big impact on it for ship owners, but first and foremost for ship owners, their focus is the safety of their crews and making sure that we can get crews to man our vessels. If we don't put appropriate security measures and appropriate safety measures in place, our crews will simply refuse to sail on our ships. So to label it just down to cost is not really an appropriate thing to do or agree to. I have to agree with John that there's an awful lot of regulation out there. There's an awful lot of recommendations out there, and it's unclear to the ship owners what levels they have to comply with, what levels they don't have to comply with. That subjectivity makes this a very grey area for everybody to work in. I think 10 years ago, awareness would have been an issue, and then we had the huge spate of piracy in the Gulf of Aden and the ISPS code, which really did focus everybody onto security in a huge way. But I think now we've developed on from that position. We have all had to start looking at where we get our information from, what are our risks, and is that information reliable information, or is it just hearsay and rumor? John and his team provide great services in terms of intelligence, and Simon and UKMTO do exactly the same, and his team provide that. And we as a ship owner have to look at those and try and work out, as non-security experts, what is our risk, and then what can we do to mitigate that risk. So cost alone, no, and awareness, no. Relevance, that definitely is something that comes up as a threat becomes more and more severe. We have to act to protect our people, which is our primary goal, to make sure that our vessels are safe and that they arrive and deliver the goods and services that keep the just-in-time economy running. You're muted.
So do you think there's anyone's ever made a business case for security, that there's ever been a front and center cost-benefit analysis being done on it, Neil?
I think we do a cost-benefit analysis on individual pieces of security activity. I don't think anybody has ever looked at the big picture of it as a whole and made that case. We've had ISPS code and the costs of that put onto the ship owners and swallowed by the ship owners. That cost has never been able to be passed on to the consumers, be that our charterers or be that the end consumer at the end, because we're on long-term fixed charters, and the people in the street who buy the goods at the end of the day don't want to pay for these extra costs. So the overall cost benefit analysis, no, I don't think it's ever been really shown to demonstrate to us. I think we've got security to a level which people, the industry, governments find is acceptable. It's not absolute, it's not 100%, but it's what they're willing to accept.
Very quickly, Simon, navies have budgetary constraints on top of the political and policy issues to deal with, but do you think that the commercial and financial constraints of the shipping industry is understood in navy and political circles?
Good question. I think in part, no. They're not fully understood, despite the 10 years of cooperation and understanding that does exist. I think one of the issues is that the management of budgets and operational costs are very different in a military operation. In EU NAVFOR, we have a budget which is for the running of the operation, which is they're called common costs, and we use that to contract services and to pay for travel and all that, and the running of the operation. But what it doesn't do is it doesn't address the running costs of the vessel. It doesn't address the operational costs of warships. That's a national cost, and that is managed by capitals and ministries of defense. And so when we're talking about the understanding of how a shipping company in the private sector works, it's very difficult for military officers to understand those pressures that exist between safety and security and the unit cost pressures of operating a ship that you have to make you're looking to make a certain amount of dollars per day. And the entire culture of unit cost is not really understood. I remember sitting in a shade meeting about 4 or 5 years ago when one of the largest shipping companies in the world was presenting to the shade meeting plenary about the costs that they incurred for their maritime security mitigation measures in the Indian Ocean. They had an enormous fleet, yes, but they listed all the different costs ranging from implementation, hardening measures, armed security services, and all those logistical costs that are associated with them. And I think the total cost figure was $24 million. And the people in the room just couldn't really understand that those costs could be that high. And it's just a fact that it's just, again, I go back to what I was saying before, is it's not the same understanding of the commercial dynamic that happens within a business, that every single cost is minutely addressed. And it's just not the same in the military. So I think no is the answer, but I think more work needs to be done.
Everyone's touched a little bit on regulation and guidance and this question of judgment and how subjective maritime security is, how much is left to interpretation. So maybe it's a good point that point in time where we look at maritime security regulation. And broadly speaking, it's actually the maritime security and the maritime industry in that regard is largely unregulated, except for the ISPS code, which, as we know, came into force in 2004. Now, it was controversial, not just for the speed at which it was brought forward and the reasons given for its requirement, but its cost has had a significant impact on the shipping industry. It's third only to SOLAS and OPA 90 in those terms. And interestingly, it's never been revised. It's never been looked at since it was brought forward and implemented in 2004. Neil, from a ship owner's perspective, is the ISPS code useful and relevant in any context today? And if it's not, what would it take direction and revision wise to make it relevant and useful to ship owners?
I'm going to step back a little bit and just start with, has it been useful to us from the beginning? And to be honest with you, I think it served its purpose. It has created a higher level of perimeter security than there was ever used to be in shipping. And it's made it harder for a ship to be turned into a weapon, which was primarily what it was designed to do. Does it work in the era of global just-in-time trade that we're in now? From a vessel's perspective, we really have no way of knowing whether the port is secure or not. We have no idea whether our spares and stores and provisions that have been looked after in that port have been secured and protected before they got to that port and while they were in that port and before they come on board our ship. In the container industry, for example, which is a little outside my area, an ultra large modern container ship has 20,000 containers on board it. I don't think anybody can really say that the contents of those, which were filled up or stuffed outside of the port and then driven into the port in lorries and sealed, whether that be outside of the port or in the port, we have no idea of knowing. I have no way of telling you what's inside that, whether it's safe or not, whether it's secure or not. And as the member of the crew of the ship, I'm not allowed to open it. I'm not allowed to touch it. I'm not even allowed to open the door, even if the seal on it is damaged. All I'm allowed to do is say, that one's been damaged. We've seen security evolve. We've seen changes take place. We've seen the BMP because we found that the ISPS code wasn't enough. We've seen in the last 2 to 3 years a huge focus in cybersecurity, in the increase in cybersecurity, yet there is nothing in the ISPS code that talks about cybersecurity at all. So what is it going to take to change it? Political will. It was political will that created it in the first place, and it seems to be political won't that doesn't want to change it now. Sorry for using a corny pun, but what can you do?
So it's an interesting question of whether security is almost too toxic a subject for the IMO to want to go back and open that Pandora's box. And conscious of on time, I just want to touch quickly on BMP, best management practices. Isn't it misnamed? Shouldn't it be minimum management practices, the minimum that ship operators are expected to do to deter piracy and enhance maritime security? Because surely best management practice, best is best, as good as it can be. Simon, do you think that the BMP doctrine meets the standard of best? And while nobody wants more regulation, do you think the shipping industry would actually benefit more if BMP was given regulatory teeth?
Good question. So let me try and tackle that from when it started. We must remember that it was put together in quite a quick period of time. I don't think a huge amount of thought had gone into the meaning of the word best at the time, if I'm honest with you. I think if in hindsight, I think minimum management practice might be good, but I think what's good about best, and I always think that's why it's so resonant to me, is that it was never a obligatory legal recommendation, and it never came under any specific convention. And for that reason, it always had to be voluntary, and for that reason, it was aspirational. And so I think if you're looking to set standards, then maybe the word best in terms of its aspirational idea is that you set the standards that others need to follow is really what we try to do, and try to encourage ship owners to set that standard, because of course you don't get that across the whole industry. But I remember sitting in the IMO in 2011 when a number of flag states submitted a paper to make a recommendation for BMP to be incorporated into the ISPS code. And these nations were predominantly seafarer nations who were concerned about the number of their citizens who were being held hostage at the time. And they were quite frustrated, to say the least. And they were looking to move this guidance into something that could be incorporated into mandatory guidance. But at the end of the day, it was rejected. And there are a number of reasons why that was the case. ISPS code is an extremely complex document, and it had taken a long time to put in. The idea of opening it was not seen as constructive. But I think, in short, it doesn't. It has achieved many a goal if you think about how it's being used in conjunction with the provision of other security services and the communication that goes in it. And it has stood the test of time, 5 evolutions later, and here we are. So ultimately, I don't think it can be put into guidance that will be mandatory or obligatory or in legal sense. But you need to continue working at it and to develop it as it evolves.
Thanks, Simon. John, in August this year, the bulk carrier Jaeger embarked a 3-man security team, one of which then effectively hijacked the vessel, demanding his back wages and be paid, and that he be repatriated. And then the guard was subsequently disembarked onto a vessel-based armory where he was videoed throwing rifles over the side because the PMSC that had hired him hadn't met his demand. And this was circulated widely on social media. Thorny question, isn't the PMSC market and vessel-based armory sector in particular in substantive need of regulatory oversight?
I think that's a great question, James. And I think if you look at it from the client perspective, that's exactly what clients should be demanding. I think they go to extant regulatory comfort at the moment of things like 28007, and actually the company in question on that, involved in that particular incident was 28007 certified. So going back to my very first opening comments, is the audit regime around that appropriate? Is it reaching the parts most in need of it reaching? Because the unique nature of the PMSC industry is that it works in multiple jurisdictions in and through international waters, and oversight is critical to make sure that incidents like that don't occur. And I think 28007 is a good framework, but it's only as good as the audit that goes behind it. and the nature and extent of that audit is ultimately paid for by the PMSC. And they, although any decent 28007 auditor would insist on a minimum standard of auditing, they are under commercial pressure effectively to their client to deliver a certification as cheaply as possible. So within the current framework, there is an issue. I think you have to talk, the PMSC market is a huge one. We often talk here about Indian Ocean Armed Guards, but obviously the whole of the Gulf of Guinea has a variety of different frameworks to counter piracy there. And emerging areas such as Mozambique, with different threats from onshore there, will have another framework requirement again based on the jurisdictions and the governments involved. So there is, again, the fragmented nature of the market, the offshore and international waters elements of it, and the cost challenges, as much as the subjective challenges we talked and judgmental challenges we talked about earlier, all lead to failures. I think I sit here now seeing how diverse those different operating environments are, and the unique demands of each of them, and struggle to see how industry can come up with something that ties them all together. But a good starting point is 28007, and some people may not realize that doesn't currently extend to Gulf of Guinea. So I think probably best to work within the framework we've got, give it more teeth, do it to a better standard. VBAs in particular should be visited routinely as a matter of course by the auditors, and not just the ones that are easy to get to. The ones in the Red Sea can take nearly a month to get there on and then off again. So there are unique challenges, but the framework needs to also be beyond kind of the Indian Ocean geography and work in other environments as well. And there is a lot of work to do on that. And at the risk of boring people, I think SCEG, the Security and Complex Environments Group, was a very noble sort of industry initiative and has done well. But again, that body has lost clients because it is ultimately something that people choose to join and has a cost of membership. And it has lost people this year because the PMSCs can't afford to join it. And that has been a forum in which a lot of these standards have been developed. And sadly, that is also losing membership. So it comes down to PMSCs pushing for the right standards and about judgment ultimately from there.
We could probably do a whole session on regulation and the efficacy of it and what we could do to make good regulation as opposed to just more regulation. But I think we'd all agree that the maritime security that we have is having some measure of effect, okay? And while we can probably sit here and pick holes in any different element of the maritime security sector at the moment, should we just focus for the last few minutes on what's good, that it is doing some good? Gary, what works well in your sector, the port sector, and what could we be translating into other maritime security sectors?
Well, I mean, the biggest thing is around all of port security is compliance and communication. I mean, you know, if you have the police not speaking with revenue and customs, who are not speaking with, you know, port security, look, they operate externally. And I think I said on another call, it was like 9/11, right? When 9/11 happened, you know, you had the NSA had some information, the CIA had some information, and the FBI had some information. If all three worked as one, it would happen. There'd be no issues whatsoever. But I mean, it's actually defining what maritime security is. You know, people just kind of go, maritime security equals piracy. It's not. You have cyber issues, you have ship and vessel security, port security, you have smuggling, you have people trafficking. It's a massive area of expanse. And I think to answer your question, it really is about standards and everybody buying into those standards. You can't have, you know, GDPR is global now. You know, there's very few countries who are not compliant with it, but if they're not compliant, you have an issue. And I mean, there's that much, you know, look, let's be honest, there's some of the ports in Africa, it's that right, you know, it's that rife down there that they will never be compliant because there's no want to be compliant. I think
joining up the dots then is probably the one key thing that the ports are developing better, but it would being able to join up the dots, have the right connectivity across the industry is crucial. Now, if I could, I want to ask each of you, give me, well, except for Gary right now, but if you could give me one measure that if implemented right away would have an immediate measurable security benefit in your sphere of operation, what would it be? And secondly, what does the future of maritime security look like to you? So we could start with Neil. One measure that if you implement it right away would have a measurable security benefit.
I think that has to be a clear international framework for putting armed guards on board ships. And making that a standardized framework that everybody works to, with the same bureaucracy, the same paperwork, the same requirements for everybody across the board. That would make it much easier. It would reduce the cost, and it would make it simpler and easier to protect our people to a higher level. And I don't know that you'll ever get agreement for that, because that's under the local jurisdiction of the flag states. But that would be my number one. Getting agreement from coastal states to have that framework anywhere in the world.
Okay, thanks. John?
Effectively in agreement with Neil, but I would call it a level playing field. So that ultimately, as a client sat there, they can compare apples and apples. Currently, the firearms regime that governs British companies is different, and licensing regime is different to companies that haven't got British employees or British ownership. There's a good example, but there are many others. And again, the fragmented nature of the market, different flag state requirements, different expectations, different levels of understanding. So a level playing field, ultimately, going back to your earlier question, based around probably one strong regulatory framework with teeth.
Thanks. Simon, if I could come to you, particularly on this question of what you'd like to implement now, but what does the future maritime security look like to you?
Well, if you ask me what I think, one thing that I think needs to be done is what I was talking about earlier regarding the lack of expertise that doesn't really exist in military operations and an understanding of the shipping industry in all its forms. I know that there are dedicated resources in the UK for supporting the industry, and there is a lot of investment in that, but it doesn't really exist internationally in any way near the levels that it needs to. So I would like to see a more of an investment and of that embedded expertise, so that what we've learned over the last 10 or 12 years is not just lost. We're seeing, as everyone's been discussing, a myriad of different security threats. It's only getting more complex and more insecure, and as we move forward, we need to address these threats in a language and a philosophy and an understanding of each other's priorities and how the industry works. So it's that link between the military construct and the shipping private sector that still needs investment and priorities and collective will.
And what does the maritime security industry look like to you in future?
I'm encouraged, because I think there is a lot more understanding of what this issue is. Trade needs to be protected. We have a myriad, as I said, we have a myriad of different threats, and that industry incorporates many different stakeholders, some of whom are on here. And I think that close cooperation has to continue. I think there needs to be a recognition, and it doesn't sit in the priorities of some governments. We hear it all the time. But unless we recognize that and continue to push it forward, then we're not going to be moving forward in that direction.
And I gather you have some news for us, Simon.
Yeah, it's just, I thought I would take the opportunity because...
we have about a minute.
I have a minute. I'm really going to be quick. I'm leaving EUNAVFOR at the end of this year after 12 incredible years. And for me, it's been really a journey of a lifetime. It's been a privilege and an honor for me to work with so many dedicated professionals in both the military sphere and in industry. When I think what we've achieved, when I think of the framework, the operational framework that we developed, I think we've set a standard and a benchmark that can be replicated in other parts of the world. I would like to see that continue. I will be staying in the maritime security domain. I'm not sure what I'm going to be doing, but hopefully I'll be working with many of you in the not too distant future. And I just really wanted to take this opportunity to thank all those people that supported me and the things that we've done together, which is, as I've described, something that I think we should all be proud of.
Thanks, Simon. And on that bombshell, everybody, I'd like to thank our panelists, John Thompson, Gary Breggin, Neil Dulling, and of course, Simon Church, who I'm sure everybody would wish well for the future. And thank you for all your efforts. And thank you to all of you for tuning in. Bye-bye.